So I'm gonna break down 12 most common reasons why your team is not doing what you expect from them. There is a chance that your team is totally made of lazy and unprofessional dilettantes, but today let's explore other options. And prepare for a lot of tangible content. This won't be one of these inspirational videos about motivation. Instead of that, I will give you actual recommendations that will help you on your managerial journey. Let's go. And the first reason is lack of clear goals and expectations. It is kind of hard for the team to achieve the goal that they just don't know. This one is rather basic, and the majority of managers that I know, they have it as a common sense. Of course, you need to set the goals for your team. Of course, you need to set expectations. But I do believe that it's still helpful from time to time, especially if your team is not performing as you expect, to think, is it actually formulated well? Is what I expect as a manager from my team formulated in the form of goals or expectations? If you've ever been in employees' shoes where your managers want something from you, but they just don't tell you what they want, this is super frustrating and it never leads to a good and predictable result. Reason number 2 is poor communication. Let's imagine we set the goals, we know the expectations. Now it is on us as managers to communicate this to our teams, communicate in a way that they will be actually able to listen and understand. If you did not communicate, or if you communicated inefficiently, this will lead to the team members conflicting with one another because they won't be aligned on where are they going in general. And you will have all kinds of misunderstandings and conflicts. Like, how can you coordinate your effort, especially if this is a goal that requires many people to work together, if the communication of this goal fails? So this communicational task is on manager. And remember that effective communication is not about what you've said, but about what they've heard. Number 3, a big, nice umbrella that I would call inadequate leadership. And here I talk about both lack of leadership and incorrect leadership style. Lack of leadership means that you practically don't give your teams enough support, guidance, and motivation. The incorrectly picked leadership style is a little bit different. Let me give you an example. If, for example, you have a junior in your team, picking a leadership style with a very high level of autonomy may be not the best idea, because at this point of career development, a junior employee needs more guidance, needs more support, and the balance between hands-on support and the autonomy may be different than the one that you should provide to a more senior person. If you would give the same level of guidance to a senior person, they would just be annoyed and it won't go anywhere. So not only look at if you're providing the necessary leadership as a manager, but also if the style that you choose to follow works with employees in your team, depending on where they are and what they require. Number 4 is lack of recognition and rewards. And I totally get it. As managers, we sometimes over-focused on the process, on the results. It is hard for us, even for us, to remember to take a step back sometimes, to celebrate the wins. Even if your team didn't achieve what you expect, but there are still things that they did well, you can still recognize it. I know that people are different and managers are different, but more often I see managers who fail to reward and recognize the achievements of the team than the ones who are overdoing it. I mean, yes, something in this presentation that they prepared was not perfect, but there were things that were good. We can acknowledge it. In the end, if you want for people in your team to be motivated, you cannot constantly be in a mode where they just deliver, you say okay, and you move on. Recognition is a very powerful thing. And maybe if right now your team is not delivering what you expect, it can be because they just lack this human element of acknowledgement, of what they're already doing. Number 5 is insufficient resources. Here's the thing. It is kind of naive to expect a team to deliver a job that requires a month in a week, or that requires a budget without a budget. Sometimes when your team is not doing what you expect, they just don't have necessary means for it. By that I mean time, budget, maybe access to stakeholders or access to the tools and technologies. I saw some managers who are having this leadership style. Okay, I give you an impossible task and you go and do it. And sometimes people go and they do it. To be honest, if you ask me, I don't think that this is a very sustainable thing to do. For me, it kind of smells like manager playing against the team, not playing together with the team to achieve something. Does it make sense? To a certain extent, I do understand that. And sometimes a more stretched goals can make people feel more motivated because I have an ambitious goal, but at the same time, it still should feel like something achievable. So just do this reality check sometimes. Are the resources that your team is having are sufficient and adequate to the goals and tasks that they're having? Number 6 is skill set mismatch. Sometimes our teams lack necessary skills that are required to do a certain job or achieve a certain goal. And it is neither good nor bad because, come on, in modern business, things are changing so quickly, and sometimes the skill set that you require for the role can also change because business evolves. The challenges that business faces evolves all the time. So in the end, the lack of necessary skills can happen. It's a job of manager to identify it. And there is also a second case where, for example, for one reason or another, it doesn't matter, a person just doesn't have a good match with the role that this person occupies. Like the core skill set of the person, like the core strength of a person does not match what is required for this particular role. Now, when we as managers are kind of fail to recognize these mismatches, we don't see any objective reason why something is not done, while the goal is not achieved or task is not done, and we kind of tend to push the negative reinforcement style. But if there is a skill set or role mismatch, pushing them harder would not help, because the underlying reason is not that people don't understand the seriousness and importance of a task, but that they don't have a skill set or any other means to do it. Reason number 7 for bad team performance is poor team dynamics. The team with personality and ego clashes, unresolved conflicts, with lack of trust to one another, it's hard for this team to be a high-performing team. Because in the end, we're all people, and things like that affect us. When we sense that the atmosphere in the team is toxic or unhealthy, it affects us. The team members who are in the conflict are getting irritated and they cannot collaborate with one another. The people who are observing this are getting demotivated because it affects everyone around. So team dynamic is not something we as managers should ignore. And sometimes, yes, as managers, we need to get involved and ensure that the conflicts are resolved and resolved productively. I think there was actually research that shows that the team that always avoids conflicts performs worse than the team that went through a stage of conflicts. The team that was able to resolve this, their performance was higher afterwards. Number 8, burnout and stress. If your team is under a constant pressure, working in very tight deadlines, if the workload is excessive, and in general, if there is an atmosphere of a constant high pressure, people are getting tired of it. Stressed people, burned out people are not performing at their best. And also, I think these things are having kind of an accumulative effect. All of us can live through and tolerate and still show good performance in a tight deadline situation, in a high pressure situation. The question is how often it happens, and if it does, for what period of time. So as managers, we can choose to push our people further, or we can choose to promote work-life balance and be a role model in that as well. Number 9, lack of accountability. Sometimes your team is having all of the means to do the job, but they just, for one reason or another, don't feel the ownership. They don't feel accountable for this to happen. Sometimes even we as managers don't hold people accountable to a reasonable extent for their actions. And this consequentially leads to people underperforming. It does not mean that we should micromanage them, but it means that we need to introduce mechanisms and processes to keep people accountable and give constructive feedback if this is not happening. Reason number 10 is resistance to change. Sometimes the success of our team requires them to innovate and to adapt and to change ways of working. And some people are just unwilling to adapt, and they actively resist to all of these changes. It can make your work as a manager super tough though. There are things that you can still do. So as a manager, you can openly communicate, explain the reason of these changes. You can support your team during the change management process. You can provide the training. You can in the end, you can lead by example. You can be yourself the ambassadors of this approach. You should not show a resistance to a change yourself. But this one, and this is my personal opinion, I think is one of the toughest sometimes to work with. Because if a person is incredibly stubborn and absolutely unwilling to change, like there is a limit of what you can do as a manager with it. Number 11 is lack of initiative. Imagine that, for example, your team is working on a project and it seems like they have everything they need, but every time there is a slight question or like concern or something is not moving forward, they're waiting for your direction, for you to kind of chip in. Instead of being more initiative or maybe like taking an initiative to drive things forward themselves. This level of initiativeness is sometimes hard to measure and not always easy to work with, because to a certain extent as a manager, you can foster a culture of, like initiativeness. But at the same time, it's kind of closely tied to each person's motivation. So there is a limit of to what extent you can affect it. Number 12 is fear of failure. Oh my God. Teams sometimes are getting totally paralyzed by that. They choose the safest option possible, avoid all kinds of risks, even when it's not reasonable, even if there are better ways to achieve the goal. But because they know or they feel that they will be punished for a mistake, they kind of choosing the option that is not the best for the end result. And it is hard to blame them. There are companies with such a deep, this culture of you will be punished for a mistake. Or people say out loud that, yes, the making mistakes is okay, but in the end, you know that you will be punished for that. So as a manager, you can do a few things. On one hand, you can not punish people for their mistakes. And on the other hand, you can encourage the openness, the open conversation about mistakes. There are all kinds of practices that encourage people to actively share what went wrong in a zero blame safe space. Things like that does help to fight this fear of failure. Now, here's what we're gonna do. 12 reasons for something is a lot. So to navigate it easier, let's categorize it. And here's what I came up with. Some of these reasons are kind of easier for you as a manager to influence. They only depend on you or mostly depend on you. And some of the things are not really depend on you. So there's like a limit of how you can influence it. So on one axis, we have easy or hard to influence. On the other hand, some of the things are more rational, more like objective in a way, and the other ones are more emotional, like emotionally charged. So that's why the reason how to work with them will be different because of that. So this is this axis. Let's start with the first one, lack of clear goals and expectations. And it is relatively easy to influence because it is something that is tied to your managerial skill set. Like you as a manager set goals, you set expectations. It is easy for you to do. And if your team does not perform because they don't have it, like there is nothing emotional about it, it's a pretty rational reason. So I would put it somewhere here. The next one is poor communication. We as managers communicate what we want from our teams and we can work on our communication skill set. So for me, it's also in the category where it is easy to influence. And if we're not explicit with what we want, it's just hard to follow. So I think it's also a pretty rational one. Now, inadequate leadership. It is for sure something that we can influence because this is a leadership style that we pick as managers. And if our leadership style does not match the needs of the people, like it's a pretty rational one. So I would put it here as well. Now, when it comes to lack of recognition and reward, it is something that we can influence, although I would say we can influence it less than the previous ones. Because like the reward part, there can be a budget part, but the recognition part is the one that we can influence. And also, I think it is sometimes less objective, like or rational in a way. It can be emotionally charged. So I would put it here. The insufficient resources is sometimes hard to influence. So it is pretty rational in a way that if you don't have enough time or you don't have enough budget, you don't have enough resources, people, it is hard to achieve these goals. So it's a pretty rational thing, but it is harder to influence. Because if the company doesn't have means, then there is a limit of what you as a manager can do here. Now, mismatch between skills and roles. I would say it's still on the rational side of things, but there is a limit of what you can influence here. Like, I would say this is even more on hard to influence part, because you can provide a training for a person to learn a necessary skill. But if there is just a deep mismatch between the person and the job, the best thing that you can do is sometimes to help this person find, for example, something else in the company, or like another role or another responsibilities where they would be able to show what they are doing, what they can do best. And sometimes it does not depend only on you, it depends on the person, it depends on the company. So this is, for me, is harder to influence. Now, poor team dynamic is tricky. Like, if you ask me, I would put it like right in the middle of it, because there is part that you can influence there, you can work on the team dynamics, but it's still dependent on the personalities of people who are there. There is a limit of what you can do. There is an obvious rational nature in it. If there is in a team with a poor team dynamics and the kind of, it's harder for people to work in this team, so it affects the performance. But at the same time, like, not all of the elements of it can be rational. Sometimes it's just like ego clashes and it's like emotional in nature. So like somewhere in between of all those things. Now, burnout and stress, we can affect as managers. If there is already an accumulative effect, there is not much then you can do. And sometimes even if you change the ways of working and if you manage the workload, it's already not enough. So it's already kind of, the effect is already there. I would put it closer to the emotional nature, because like this is a very subjective thing. It doesn't mean that this is irrational or illogical. Now, burnout and stress, they are like absolutely legit. The point is, it is very subjective. And sometimes when we think that person is going through something that would be minor for us, can be not that minor for them. Now, lack of accountability is something that we can influence. So it's on us to create the processes to keep people accountable. So it should be in the right side. If it's rational or emotional, I think it's somewhere in between. But my observation is that managers are often approaching accountability in a very dry and rational manner. Like, this is what you gotta do, you go and do it. And neglect the emotional component of it, which is also important. So that's why, to compensate for that, I would put it in the emotional nature. Now, resistance to change. I already commented on that, but I think this is relatively hard to influence. Again, like my opinion, but I think it is. And sometimes it can be rational, but a lot of aspects of why people are resistant to change have an emotional nature in it. So sometimes it's not a matter of explaining the rationale behind the change, but acknowledging the emotional aspects of it, acknowledging the emotions of people who are going through the change. So I would put it there. Okay, last two, bear with me. Lack of initiative is rather hard to influence. Not hard, but it's harder to influence that, for example, lack of accountability, because level of initiativeness is something that people just sometimes choose or prefer to show or not showing. Like, as a manager, you can influence it, but in the end, it's the choice of each particular person. So I would say maybe somewhere here. And finally, fear of failure. Like, it's possible to influence. I would not say it's easy. And it is very much emotional in nature. From you as a manager to work with it, it requires more of a emotional intelligence than analysis of things, if that makes sense. That was a fun exercise. And by the way, if you're thinking about how to grow your managerial skill set, or maybe if you're even thinking about having a formal managerial education, I made a video about why MBA may not be exactly for you. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you there.